start the session. That session is planned by the Tapestry project. So I'm Nobu Ote from Kyoto University, Japan. I'm one of the co-PI of the Tapestry project. So Tapestry abbreviated the expression of our project title, Transformation as Praxis. So exploring socially just and transdisciplinary pathway to sustainability in marginal environments. So this project is international research collaboration with teams from UK, Norway, India, and Japan on how communities in climate vulnerable and marginal environments need to or can make a transformation for a sustainable future. So today we have 4 speakers who is going to speak on different aspects of our project. So then after the 4 lectures have finished, we would like to accept the questions from audience and have discussions. So I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Professor Leila Mehta. She's a professor of Institute of Development Studies in UK, and she's the lead PI of our project, Tapestry project. So would you please start, Leila?
Thank you so much, Nobu, and hello, everybody, wherever you are. It's great to be here. Thank you very much to the South Asia Regional Hub, colleagues in ICCCAD, Celine, Sumaya, Mahmouda, for the opportunity for Tapestry to present here. This is the first of 3 presentations. As Nobu said, Tapestry stands for Transformation as Praxis, exploring socially just and transdisciplinary pathways to sustainability in marginal environments. We've been working since the end of 2019, so a lot of the time has been in the pandemic. We're working across Bangladesh, India, Japan, Norway, and UK. And this is a project which is funded by the Belmont Forum, ISC, Norface, EU, as well as 4 research councils from our respective countries. So what we're doing in this project is we're focusing on how transformation may arise from below in marginal environments in India and Bangladesh that are characterized by climate change uncertainties. And for us, key to the topic is that transformation goes beyond maintaining the existing system. So we don't just merely want the system to be resilient or stable. We're looking at the politics around that. And we really want to go beyond incremental adaptation as well as mitigation. Because we see from the people marching on the streets in Glasgow, elsewhere, that we really need structural change. We need deep-seated change, all-encompassing change. And incremental changes are not really possible, and they can also be maladaptive. So this is really an opportunity to reconfigure the trajectory of development and really change consumption, decarbonize, get rid of, a lot of these negative practices that people on the streets of Glasgow have been clamoring about, and rightly so. And all over the world, actually, not just Glasgow. But of course, can be a messy process. These kind of transformations are diverse. They can be unruly because you're challenging incumbent structures and power relations. So we're looking at that happening in very, very particular places. And what we're also doing is looking at the links between transformation and uncertainty, because the impacts of climate change are very difficult to predict, especially at the local level. And so climate change interacts with lots of other drivers of change: property development, infrastructure, capitalist trajectories, etc. So we're trying to understand these different linkages. So our focus is on these environments where uncertainties associated with floods, droughts, cyclones, and uneven impacts of policy processes, capitalist expansion are threatening people's well-being and sense of place. And this, of course, exacerbates the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities. Now, mostly, there's been a tendency to control and manage uncertainties from above, or even climate change from above, and not really look at those who are at the front line. And this often fails or harms vulnerable people and marginalized people. And these are the people who are bearing the brunt of climate change. So what we're asking is that while all this can cause anxiety about the future, or is usually controlled in certain ways, can it also be an opportunity for transformation? And here we're looking at bottom-up transformation. So we're working with poor coastal communities on the front line. So we're working with fishing communities in the mega city of Bombay, and we'll hear more from that from Professor Partha Sati, who is the PI from IIT Bombay. We're going to listen to we're looking at camel herders and villagers in the drylands of coastal Kutch, and Shilpi and Ranit will talk more about that. And later this week, we have 2 presentations focusing on the Sundarbans, the huge delta. But for all these people, climate change is not a distant threat. It's really a reality in their everyday life. And as I said, they're faced with new uncertainties from climate change, but also processes such as expanding industries, pollution. But none of these people are victims of climate change. They're looking to transform the conditions. And we are actually, together with alliances, together with community-based organizations, we're trying to collectively study how this societal change is taking place from below in their efforts to tackle climate and other changes. So these are in these sites, which we call patches, people are forming alliances, sharing their knowledge and challenging powerful and vested interests. And so we're trying to understand how this is happening. So what's key in our project is this notion of transformative alliances. So we're looking at local communities, NGOs, scientists, and some state agencies that are seeking socially and environmentally just alternatives. So very quickly now, I'm going to wrap up on our methods and our approach. Many of us have been working in these areas for a long, long time. So we're working with locally based partners, but we're also building on long durée perspectives. If it hadn't been for the pandemic, it would have been months and months of ethnography and in-depth field work, but we've still been doing a bit of it. And I think we'll hear a little about what has been possible. Visual methods have been a big part of what we do. So photo voice, artistic contributions, and there's a session specifically on that later this week. We're looking at things historically also to try and understand these changes over time through archival research. Nobu and colleagues have been contributing with natural science, so looking at GIS remote sensing and bringing that knowledge with indigenous perspectives and participatory mapping. And we'll hear more about that in the Kutch presentation. So bringing in local perspectives and framing our research and focus. And I think all this is about co-production, but co-production not in just bringing actors together, but really trying to challenge dominant knowledge and framings. So I guess we're really interested in epistemic, environmental, social, and gender justice, and we're looking at the root causes of vulnerability arising from climate-related uncertainties. And research is part of the change. So that's why a transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary method of engagement has been very critical. This has been challenging, of course, and if we have time, we'll talk a little about some of these challenges. But it's also been being attentive to the buzzwords like resilience, transformation, because they all have their dark sides. There's politics around it. All, who is paying the price for resilience? Whose resilience matters? Unpack some of the community dynamics. Look at questions of gender, social difference, power, politics, co-option, and looking at some of the messy and fraught nature, as well as the political nature of these processes. So I'll stop now and I'll hand over to my colleagues who will pick up on some of these issues in their talks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very comprehensive introduction of our project and the relationship between, this session resilience in COP26. So next speaker is the Dr. Shilpi Srivastava. She's also the active researcher of our project, and also Ranit Chatterjee of the Kyoto University. So would you start, Shilpi or Ranit?
Thanks, Nobu, and hello,
Yes.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all of you who are present here today, either in the session, in this hybrid session. As Leila's already explained and given an overview of the project, so we will focus in this quick presentation. We will focus really on one of the patches, which is Kutch. the landscape of Kutch, which is a border district of on the northwestern frontier of India. So it is a district very close to the India-Pakistan border. It's an ecologically dynamic ecosystem. And here we are working actually with camel pastoralists and trying to think about how to co-produce change from below, change that matters to them, centering their voices and concerns in terms of what is required and how to bring about change, a real transformative change, which really centers their perspective and teasing out some of the challenges as this process evolves in Kutch. So Kutch is known for its livestock and distinct indigenous breeds. However, in mainstream conservation and policy discourses, pastoralism is often denigrated for being backward and unproductive and blamed for environmental degradation, especially in relation to the degradation of mangroves and their habitats. In addition to climate uncertainties in this particular location in the form of droughts and more recently floods, it's the aggressive pace of industrialization that has substantially altered the landscape of Kutch. It has resulted in loss of common grazing lands, water pollution, degradation of mangrove forests, as well as land grabs, really leading to and exacerbating some of the vulnerabilities of natural resource dependent communities in this area. Because of these changes, the survival of an indigenous breed of camels, the Karai camel or the swimming camels that predominantly rely on mangroves for their fodder needs is substantially threatened. And in this particular patch, we're actually working on the Karai pastoral system with these herders to work on the revival of this breed, as well as for the broader well-being of the herders that actually breed these camels and are quite synergistically and syncretically linked to the survival of these camels. Sorry. So our research is taking place at a very crucial juncture in Kutch, where camel rearing is said to be witnessing a revival due to the efforts of one of our partners, NGO, Sehjeevan, and the Kutch Camel Herders Association, KUMS. So both KUMS and Sehjeevan are our local partners in Kutch. The Karai camel was recognized as a distinct breed in 2015 by the government of India. To protect this distinct breed, KUMS and Sehjeevan have partnered with public and private dairy supply chains to mainstream camel milk production and supply. To sustain this network of milk collection, it is important that the conservation of traditional grazing routes to the mangroves is restored and existing natural base in terms of fodder and water needs on which the Karai breed depends is protected. So the underlying hope is that this mainstreaming of the milk initiative will actually achieve the twin goals of preservation of the Karai camels, so which is mal. In this case, it's the livestock. So mal is the Kutchi word for livestock, as well as mangroves. So preservation of both the Karai camels as well as restoration of mangroves, and will create livelihood improvement, bringing wider benefits to the pastoral community. This initiative is also critical in countering the mainstream narrative around pastoralism being responsible for environmental degradation in Kutch. So there are 4 key components in the Kutch work, which is basically around climate change uncertainties, the relationship of climate change with mangroves and the whole landscape, the relationship of mangroves with camels, as well as the broader community. And these are the 4 key points around which our work revolves in Kutch. Now I'll hand over to my colleague Ranit, who will briefly explain how we actually designed this whole work as a bottom-up process. Ranit, over to you.
Thank you, Shilpi. And I'll start with, we are looking at climate change possibly and trying to understand what are the impacts at the global scale or regional scale or maybe at national scale. But it's equally important to understand, and that's what we are trying to address in the Tapestry project, is how the impacts are at the hyper-local scale, which is which needs a possibly integrated approach and an interdisciplinary approach, which we are trying to do in this Tapestry project, where we bring in the expertise of social sciences as well as the natural sciences. And what we are trying to do is integrate participatory mapping, where we include the the pastoralist and create ownership, and also look at the kind of knowledge which is available with them, which dates back possibly beyond what is available or what we can access through the GIS and remote sensing data. And we try to integrate that knowledge in and see and overlay it on the GIS and remote sensing platform and see if both of these different approaches can be generating a data set which would be giving us a much more detailed understanding of what the changes have been happening at the very local scale. And this is what we have been targeting in Tapestry by involving the local pastoralists to design, identify, and also decide on the protocols so that there is a long-term ownership. I'll hand over to Shilpi.
Thanks, Ranit. So there are two processes that are simultaneously being studied in our research in Kutch. So one that Ranit has just touched upon around the GIS mapping of mangroves, where we are also trying to counter some of this belief where a lot of scientists claim and government claims that actually grazing is leading to degradation of mangroves. And through this GIS mapping and co-production, we're trying to study whether this is really happening or not, actually mapping these at the very local level. The second component is really about studying the milk initiative. So there is a relationship between milk and mangroves as well, because Karai depends on the mangroves, and the quantity and quality of mangroves determines the quantity and quality of milk. But there is a challenge with this initiative as well. Though the Camel Milk Initiative is a key example of grassroots mobilization, especially given its nature of community-based organization around Kum, Sejivan, as well as the pastoralists, there are also some challenges with the milk initiative itself, because camel milk has low shelf life. It's saline in nature, so it requires a very tedious and complicated process of supply and demand, and it is quite time sensitive in terms of when it's collected and how it's supplied to the dairy. So the initiative is really in its inception phase, because it started in 2016. So it's been there for about 4.5 years, but we've had a pandemic in between, which has also disrupted some of the supply and demand of around this initiative, and we are still working through it. So there is really what we've observed, although there are so many challenges around these, what we've observed in our research so far is the decentralized and democratic process of decision-making around negotiating and discussing some of these challenges. And more recently, the picture that you see at the bottom, which has just arrived from our colleague who was doing fieldwork until last week, was really about some of these challenges being discussed in a CUMS meeting in Kutch. So some quick reflections, and I would like to wrap up now around the work that we've been doing in Kutch. Is what we've observed so far is that, yes, these initiatives are actually, they are being welcomed by herders, but there are challenges around supply and demand, exposing them to the vagaries of the market. And this have been exacerbated to a degree because of pandemic disruption, because the milk supplies were really suspended for almost 6 months last year. And there has been a lot of back and forth, and Sejivan and CUMS are trying to work their way through it. The wider changes in the political economy are also driving changes within the herder community itself. So there may be several visions of what change may.
Have we lost her?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, we can just, I guess what she was going to say would be the looking at the dark, understanding community dynamics. Ranit, you can also then chip in later. I guess gender is an issue, I guess, because as you saw in the picture, a lot of the people who actually are providing the outreach are men. So really unpacking some of these intra-community dynamics and some of the wider ecological issues. Ranit, you may want to wrap up too, and then I think we can hand over.
Yeah, thank you.
Since we've lost Shilpi, so I just jumped in there.
Sure.
Thanks, Leila.
Yeah, and I think there's also this issue of what is happening at the local level and mapping that over a period of time, because that area has been kind of there is a lot of lived experiences which is there, and those are very important not only to document but also to see that how those lived experiences are transforming and what kind of future impacts those lived experiences might have in relation to what we are looking at, the changes at the global or more regional scale. And so this is where we are positioning ourselves in the Tapestry project, and we are looking at how we can take care of the uncertainties and transformation that is happening at the very hyper-local scale in Kutch. Yeah, with that,
Okay.
possibly I'll end. Over to you, Professor Nobu.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any words for final in Shilpi? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
There was a power supply issue at my place. So I was just trying to conclude with the fact that there are dark sides to transformation as well. And it's really important to look at some of how are we challenging these power inequities within our research as well, between the researcher as well as the communities that we are working with and within the community itself. I'll stop there.
Okay,
I guess
thank
one
you.
last point I would like to add is that whatever we're studying also needs to be looked at in the wider district. And this is a district that's been drastically industrialized. And you have these big companies that are now claiming to be the green saviors, that are doing wind farms and actually grabbing some of the lands of these pastoralists. So whatever we're doing in Kutch also really, the whole question of climate justice also really needs to be put in there of the district. So I think that's also a critical point when we're talking about transformation and the politics of it.
Okay, thank you very much for addition. I'd like to go for the next speaker. It's the Professor Devanasan Pasatalasi. He is an professor of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. And then he's also one of the co-PI of this project. So he's going to talk about the Mumbai Pat. Please start.
Thank you very much, Nobu.
Yes.
Thanks also to Sumaya, Mahmooda, Prathama, Ranit, and everyone else who's managed to put this together, and especially to Celine as well. We know that the idea of pathways to transformation was mainstreamed in the policy realm first in the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, but that was mostly with reference to mitigation and not adaptation and resilience. And we still see in the current COP26 as well, much of the discussion has been about mitigation, whereas the key issues related to resilience, adaptation, transformation are not really being discussed at the high level by policymakers and political leaders. And that is a significant gap between the protesters on the streets and those in the rooms speaking in the high level policy forums. And so we are very thankful that we are able to be part of this Climate Resilience Hub initiative at COP26, because we think that this issue is extremely important, especially for developing countries. This is the Mumbai patch that Leila mentioned, is one of the 3 patches for the Tapestry project. We wish to acknowledge all the participants, the partners, the organizations on whose behalf I'm presenting now. Also, wish to highlight that there is a key element to the Mumbai patch where we are focusing on a metropolitan region, but we are trying to link the futures of a very large resource-dependent community, namely the fisherfolk, known locally as the coolies, whose livelihoods are significantly affected both by urban development and climate change, but who also have a very important role to play in reducing disaster risks arising from climate change. And that's why we are talking about co-producing the futures of the city of Bombay with the fisherfolk and not exclude these communities in our imaginations of the future. So as most of you will know, Mumbai is one of the largest and densely populated cities in Asia. It's India's commercial capital. It's chronically flood prone, as we have seen in the last 15 to 20 years. But also in recent years, it emerges as among the top 5 cities in the world in terms of vulnerability to climate change. The coolies are the traditional artisanal small-scale fishing communities who occupy a number of fishing villages known as koliwadas within the city's borders and over which they have substantial control and ownership. So there's been a long history of their dependence on the coast, which are increasingly being contested, as in the case of Kutch that Leila, Shilpi and Ranit mentioned. And this contestation is something that we are intervening in through this project to see how the connections between the people dependent on the coastal ecosystems and urban development can be re-articulated in terms of bringing about a transformation when it comes to climate change. So the Mumbai patch is highly vulnerable. There are a range of anthropogenic as well as climate hazards that have hit the city and the region in the last few years with huge amount of economic, social, and ecological impacts. We've seen that urban planning and development largely marginalizes climate disaster and livelihood concerns of those who live and depend on coastal ecosystems. But on the other hand, there is also a huge role that these communities can actually play in reducing the risk, not just for themselves, but for all coastal communities in the Mumbai metropolitan region as such. And therefore, when we are looking at climate change, uncertainty, and transformation, we are interested in addressing issues of equity, justice, inclusion, and so on, so that this linked futures of the fisherfolk and the city can be significantly addressed. We've seen through a series of tropical storms and cyclones hitting the west coast of India and Bombay, that climate change is beginning to make a huge impact on the west coast, which earlier was not so much exposed to storms, cyclones, sea level rise, and so on. This is becoming the new normal. Chronic flooding has become common. We also see that the factors that lead to flooding have multiple sources, not just from climate change, but anthropogenic factors as well. And we also see that the response of the state has been very minimal. There is very limited discussion of resilience. There is a politics to resilience, as Leila mentioned, where the state tends to cop out by saying the communities are resilient and uses it as an excuse not to do anything. And therefore, there's an almost complete absence of adaptation strategies, especially with reference to flooding. And added to this, like in the case of Kutch, there are mega infrastructure projects, informalization, industrialization, which leads to further exclusion of the fisherfolk, but also create further risks for flooding. And our project tries to bring together different actors and different voices into dialogue so that we can address these challenges. We have not spent too much time on this, but just to reiterate that this politics of resilience that Leila highlighted at the beginning, we need to understand this, we need to unpack this in terms of understanding what are the sources of ecological uncertainties, both anthropogenic and climate related, the political economy issues that have been highlighted earlier as well, but also more importantly, the issues related to identity and culture, which are not to be easily dismissed because these are linked to different ways of understanding inequality, the ways in which coastal fisherfolk contest state developmental policies, the importance of inequalities within communities around caste and gender. So these are very important for us to understand so that the kind of resilience and transformation we are talking of can actually be robust and do not lead to the dark side that Shilpi was referring to earlier. So we are trying to align ourselves with local actors who are actually involved in ongoing transformations related to mangroves, reimagining coastal ecosystems, initiatives in these koliwadas, fishing villages, in terms of resisting urban development projects, and participate in larger environmental activism in the city and at the regional level. So the potential for transformation that we have identified and we are looking at include addressing issues of different kinds of inequalities. The second is, how do we address the problem of urbanization and environmental shifts, which are badly affecting the artisanal and small-scale fishers in the Kolivadas in the city? What is the role of governance and decision-making? How do we transform these? And therefore, we are partnering with a local environmental organization, which is significantly involved in putting pressure on state policies, especially with reference to mangroves. And finally, how technology and urban planning can be reimagined, starting at a very local level in one of the Kolivadas for addressing issues of pollution, which affects livelihoods, health, and so on, and then see if we can scale it up. So very quickly, I'll just spend half a minute on some of the significant things that we're doing here. So Bombay 61 is one of our local partners in one of the fishing villages, the Versova Kolivada, which is in the west coast of Bombay, where, as I've said, the coolies have been affected by political marginalization, livelihoods have been affected, significant impacts of pollution on fish catch, on health. And there's also a politics to the waste management of the city, which is the significant impact of that is borne by the coastal communities, because the creeks pass through their fishing villages and the mangroves. There is, of course, on the one hand, they are facing the brunt of climate change, sea level rise, coastal erosion, tropical storms. On the other side, there is the significant impact from urban encroachments, and therefore they sort of caught between the devil and the deep sea in terms of facing the multiple impacts. All of these are substantially changing the uncertainties, creating large kinds of uncertainties in many different ways for the coolies. And we are trying to see what kind of transformative practice, so that's why praxis is there in the title of the project, can be forged in addressing these kinds of challenges. So a series of workshops have been held through which we have designed strategies for creek cleaning, restoration of livelihoods, alternative livelihoods strategies, and the technology initiatives that I mentioned earlier. The Norwegian partners, Hans and Sinner, are looking more at the contestations from social legal perspective. So a series of very large infrastructure projects, this part of the neoliberal imagination, are being put in place for catering to the city's elites' transportation needs. And these are having an immense impact, especially on the coastal communities, the fishing communities. And the contestations, the legal, social contestations of these is something that we are looking at. And so looking at transformation from the legal perspective around issues of space occupied for livelihoods in the coastal areas, which are also very important for disaster risk mitigation. IIT Bombay, our institution, and the Conservation Action Trust are looking at transformation in terms of policies and legal changes as well as institutions. So a series of court cases and petitions have led to the judiciary intervening to impose pressure on the state to create new policies, laws, and institutions, especially for the conservation of mangroves, which are seen to have a significant role in flood risk mitigation. And therefore, we're trying to look at the relationship between climate extremes, urban flooding, and the role of ecosystems in risk mitigation. This is especially through by documenting the public interest litigation, where the Conservation Action Trust has been trying to map the changes in mangrove cover and what are the impacts of these, and we're trying to match these with the work that Nobu and others are doing on using remote sensing as well as participatory mangrove mapping to link the mangroves to flood risk mitigation and to livelihoods. Mihir, who will be speaking next, has been conducting a series of workshops, bringing together the different actors in dialogue and see how the understanding and the hybrid knowledge that these roundtables produce will help us to come up with alternative strategies for deliberate transformation. And finally, we have a case study in Dahisar, which is one of the river basins in the north of Bombay, which faces chronic flooding. And so through this case study, we're trying to find out, we are looking at a local alliance which has come together for adaptive flood management, and we're especially trying to understand what is the tipping point that led to this kind of a transformation in the phase of the failure of the state, and how local actors responded both in the short term and the long term to put together a more sustainable and inclusive strategy for flood risk mitigation. So as we mentioned earlier, the reasons for flooding are to do with poor urban planning, infrastructure development, construction, encroachments, and so on. But using Karen O'Brien's 3 spheres of transformation approach, we mapped a series of strategies through which this alliance and local network came together to address flood risk mitigation in many different ways, by addressing issues of solid waste management, management of water bodies, protecting those most vulnerable, sharing costs, and doing regular annual maintenance work, which actually the municipal corporation is supposed to do, but which it doesn't. So overall, there are 4 broad areas that we are focusing on in terms of studying transformation in the Mumbai patch: the structural, technical, and institutional transformation, starting at a very local level and trying to scale up; participatory mapping of wetlands, especially the mangroves; specific action projects for transformation, the flood risk mitigation that I mentioned in Dahisar; finally, coming up with alternative planning strategies for the city as a whole, with Bombay 61 as the lead partner for this. So I'd like to end with this by saying that the transformative alliances that are required for deep structural change that we are identifying from the Bombay patch focuses on different actors coming together, an emphasis on alternatives that are socially just, not just ecologically sound, producing hybrid knowledge, plural understandings from below, not just using expert and scientific knowledge, scaling up from below using a bottom-up approaches with marginalized people at the center, keeping their concerns and problems at the center, and through co-production involving academics, civil society, NGOs, and local level state actors. I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Detailed introduction of the Mumbai patch activity and also background of the Mumbai studies. Thank you very much. So I'd like to move on to the next speaker. It's a final talk today. This session is by Mr. Mihir Pad. He is the director of All India Disaster Mitigation Institute, and also our powerful member of the Tapestry project. So Mihir, would you prepare for?
Yes. So thank you very much for, I think, the slides.
Would you turn off the sharing? Oh.
No, and I think
yeah,
okay. This is fine. So I have no slides. No, thank you very much for this opportunity, Nobu-san, and
yes,
I'll quickly and in 7 minutes address the title of what we've ventured out to cover. And I've been lucky to have very succinct and solid presentation on the Kutch patch from Shilpi and Ranit, and on Bombay patch from Deeparth Sarthi. What I'm going to talk about bridging the gaps between various levels and various sectors that exist when this project is being unfolded. And I'm building on, this is not original, work that Sina, is a member of our group, has actually done and written about. We've all contributed, but I'm just taking those ideas a bit further to see that in this particular piece of our work, how is it unfolding? So in that sense, it's not my work, but all the mistakes are mine. So I'm fully responsible for that. This is a reflective presentation. So I'm going to look back at both what Shilpi and team and Parthasarthi team has done, but I'm also going to look at some of the discussions and roundtables that we've had in the past and some of the field visits. It is also, Also presentation forward-looking, as that's what Mehta had told us, that when we present at this hub, we should be suggestive of what possible, not firmly, but tentatively what is possible to move ahead. And it is also, and also it sort of recognizes the fact which both of the previous presentations have recognized, and I would underline it even more, that a lot is being done. A lot of efforts and time and money is being put by communities themselves, citizens themselves, in taking adaptive measures and taking mitigation measures so that they can address climate change. What our project does is demonstrate some of those and how they can be further supported when co-production, co-creation is taking place. So that's something I'm about to say. Two things which we've learned from the past, and first is bridging the gap. And number one, we've learned that there is no one single bridge. There are many bridges, and that's unusual architecturally and urban planning wise, but conceptually, it's very important to remember that there is no one way of crossing the bridge, the gap. And that's something we've quite sort of clearly seen in the past work, and this work we see that again. And second is that there is no one gap. Actually, there are many gaps, and they need to be addressed simultaneously as well, because they keep on moving. So it's not like a river where there is a one bank and second bank, and then you're bridging it's more complicated than that. So that is one. The second is that the gaps are of various natures. Mainly, we are looking at the gaps which are structural and from the social science point of view, but also there are sectoral gaps, partial gaps, temporal gaps, and those gaps become even more important when we talk about transformation and we talk about in the sense of mitigation, which COP26 is looking at so very directly. And this we are doing it from two main points of view. One is the dryland communities, and second is marginalized groups within that particular community. Also during this work, I have realized, I think my team members have realized as well, that the rate at which the gaps are growing between the middle, top, and bottom, and various types of knowledge is actually accelerating these gaps, the size of the growth of the gaps. And that's something I find alarming and even more compelling, that we need something which is transformative to address that. Therefore, two concepts, resilience and transformation. And that's something we are trying to address. And it needs to be dual in terms of the transformative actions need to be resilient. And that is not always happening. A lot of transformative work that we see around is actually only solving the immediate next problem, but is not resilient. And a lot of resilience projects that we see, efforts that are being done, mainly top-down, are not transformative or not transformative enough. So this both aspects, dual transformative resilience and resilient transformation simultaneously happening, that is something more important in bridging the gap when I reflect at the work that comes to my mind. And within that, examples are four key sectors. There are more, but I'll stick to that. One is a lot of gender-related work is missing out on that. That is, they are either transformative, but not enough resilient, or they are resilient, not enough transformative. It's only when you address the gender issue directly and upfront, you are likely to achieve both, not necessarily, but that becomes a very important key. The second important key is livelihoods work. So when you address the work-related needs, maybe of the pastoralists, maybe of the coastal communities such as fisher, so on and so forth, you are likely to address both of these aspects simultaneously. The third is related to well-being, and that was not so clear in the early part of our work, but after the pandemic, it has become even more clear that unless help directly, not only medical care or Medicare, further health, community health, public health, and even beyond that well-being, if that's not addressed, whatever effort that you are making is not going to be as transformative as it is likely to be. And last and behold, again, very importantly, Nobuhito-san and Ranit Thai can talk more about it, but the whole new technology of geospatial and digital technology, they offer us tremendous promise, and how well we use that to harness for the purpose of resilience and transformation, that's something up to us. So first major conclusion is that we need to bridge the gap from awareness, raising more and more awareness about this gap that exists, to advocacy. So actively turn the need, the latent demand, into an active demand by communities and people like us at the middle and top, actively demanding that resilience has to be transformative and transformation has to be resilient. And that we see in our particular project, but we also see that around, that when that demand is done, actively asked for, you are likely to see the change one. Of course, that demand has to be bottom up as much as possible, but also lateral, that is various colleague groups across various areas talking to each other and collectively demanding the change they need. So that's the first bridging the gap from awareness to advocacy. The second bridging the gap is from investment to funds. A lot of transformation money and a lot of resilience money is an investment, and you need the return from that, and which means that the return will go higher and higher up. And how do you avoid that and have funds which will remain where the investments are made, that is in the community, in their hands, in their institutions, in their activities, so that it will, and now there are ways to do that. This is not part of our project directly, but there are social impact funds which allows that to happen. There are green and clean bonds which allows that to happen. Community bonds, there are insurance and risk transfer tools which allows that to happen. And you have the mitigation pools, because if everybody was insured and nobody was mitigating the measures, we won't have money to pay for it. So these are the financial funds we already have, and we need to apply that to make resilience transformative and transformation resilience. And that's possible. So that's the third. And the last and most important, third and most important bridge is bridging from governance, the ways of managing, running, to actually decentralization, very active decentralization and co-production of the whole processes. And here social media perhaps can be very useful. More experiments and innovations need to be done there. Digital technology can be very useful. We need to look at how that is possible. And geospatial opportunities already exist, and we saw some of that work in Kutch. We will see that in Bombay as well. And also the data revolution, if you will, due to the pandemic, a lot more can be done in terms of deciding what you decide using data that is available, provided there is access to data and there is ownership of data, and the data is in public domain. So these are the areas to bridge the gap from governance to decentralization. And the last one is about bridging the gap from preparedness, which we all have been asking for so far, to anticipation. And perhaps Shilpi will answer some questions subsequently. But what we see is during the last 3 or 4 years of the project, that there is more and more what she has been calling cascading risk and cascading disaster, one after the other. So you have 2 cyclones simultaneously, almost in 1 month, or you see that there is a cyclone after flood, or there is a flood after cyclone. So this cascading, compounding, double disasters taking place. And for that, preparedness is not enough, because we are not prepared for these simultaneous risk episodes taking place. So we need to anticipate. And we need to anticipate at both levels, top and bottom. Bottom level, we need to take anticipatory actions so that the people who are affected have some sort of social protection which wouldn't allow them to go down double because of there are two risks that they have faced, and basic income. But also at the top, you have so that there are anticipatory financial and other preparedness measures which are taking place. And now the heat wave is increasing, tropical cyclones are increasing, AR6 very clearly mentions where we are heading, and there is no way we can only be happy to be prepared. We used to think so, but we have to anticipate and mobilize our resources, efforts to do that. With this, I would like to end and repeat three things. One is that transformation has to be resilient and resilience has to be transformative. There is no way that cannot be addressed. Second, there is no one bridge, multiple bridges, and we need to keep that in mind, multiplicity. And same with the gaps, multiplicity of gaps, but accelerating gaps. And that's something we see more and more on the sites. To end, there are three ways to, three key areas. One is gender, livelihoods, wellness, and geospatial technology, possible ways to move ahead. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And Nobuhito-san, please.
All right. Thank you very much for your talk, the conceptual talk about the gap, many gaps in between. Seems we can use little more time after 1 hour from the Mr. Haider told us. So we have a time for discussion, probably let's say 20 minutes or something. So I'd like to accept some questions for on the each presentations. If you have any questions to three presentation and also introductory presentation for by Leila, anyone have questions? Let's see.
There are some points in the chat, Nobu. Maybe you can.
Yeah, I saw that the agrivoltaics. It's a comment on the, I think that's the Kutch presentations, right? So would you answer or comment on that comment, Shilpi, please?
Maybe we can invite Samuel to, because we did put in some comments, so maybe we can have a discussion around it if required. If Samuel is still around.
I can't see Samuel.
Okay. So it was, I think the question was mainly around agrivoltaics could be a way forward, because we were discussing that because of industrial development, there's been substantial reallocation of land and how that has marginalized the pastoral communities. And he was suggesting, as far as I understand, that maybe with agrivoltaics, where the land can be co-shared between the energy farm as well as the farmers. So there's some system of sharing, and this may help both communities. So it will help in infrastructural development and the cause of renewable energy, plus it'll also not lead to further making these farmers or resource communities marginal or vulnerable. And our response was mainly around how are these processes determined. So not just in Kutch, because Kutch, as we explained in the presentation, there's a particular political economy around it. So there are two reasons. One is that pastoralism is denigrated within mainstream discourses. So the government actually doesn't want people to herd anymore. They should migrate into other so-called productive livelihoods. So there's that one discursive challenge. And the second is that these commons were reallocated for industrial development. So there is very negligible prospect of land sharing or any form of sharing. It's basically about grabbing land and marginalizing these communities and dispossessing them. So I think there is the whole political economy which needs to be looked at. And with any of these solutions, these technical solutions, as Leila also pointed out in her reply, it is about how this process is managed, whether it's top down or bottom up, and whose concerns are really centered. So these are communities at the front line of climate change. They are the ones who are vulnerable to some of the worst effects of climate change. And we are dispossessing them of the very resources which are required to build their adaptive capacity. So when we talk about technical solutions, I think it's really important to look at what is the political economy of these solutions and whose voices are getting centered and who's benefiting. I don't know if anybody else wants to add from our team, or we have another question from Celine actually in the chat now.
Yeah, we do have questions from Celine. How do we bridge the gap between local knowledge and scientific knowledge with local communities?
I can quickly respond to that, and then maybe if Mihir wants to respond as well.
I think so. Yeah, please.
Thank you. That's very useful methodological question, but also something to do with what we call as praxis. I'll perhaps respond to you using examples. So mangroves are an important part of our tapestry project across all 3 patches. And working in Bombay, I've heard fishing communities and their leaders talk about the importance of mangroves for flood risk mitigation from the 90s, but nobody ever paid attention to them. So it's only when flooding became very severe and having a huge economic and social impact that other environmental organizations, think tanks, scientists began taking them seriously. And the state was still not willing to address it because it's very real estate politics comes into play. So environmental organizations, environmental activists and scientists were able to come together in organizing these petitions to protect the mangroves. And that's where the environmental activists and NGOs came together with fishing communities and their organizations also, and where the livelihood concerns around mangroves and the flood risk potential, mitigation potential of mangroves began to be highlighted, and the state began to take it more seriously. So the coming together of local knowledge about mangroves and expert knowledge from scientific communities was really key when it came to making a difference in terms of setting up new policies, laws, and institutions for mangrove protection in Mumbai. And there is substantial work to also show how fishing communities very effectively used scientific knowledge about coastal ecosystems in general in contesting the coastal regulation zone norms and the violation of these norms in various forums, National Green Tribunal and courts in the Indian context. So just a few examples of how these can come together for more effective coastal conservation.
Okay, thank you very much. Would you comment?
Leila, I think you need to raise your hand here around the...
Mihir first, and then Leila. Is that okay?
Okay. No, very quickly, Leila. One is that we found that, this is no new news, but putting the last first, or putting the last person, woman in this case, who's vulnerable and poor, and starting from that, this whole co-creation process has really helped. One, and one assumes that there isn't much of knowledge or experience, but that's exactly not the case. It's actually quite opposite. One, and second is a lot of collective wisdom, or people to people, or woman to woman in this case, or camel pastoralist to another camel pastoralist. Bringing that together has also made a lot of difference, because in this day and age, collective voice matters far more than individual voice as far as changes are concerned. I can add the list, but Leila, you had to say something. Please go ahead.
Yeah, please. Leila, please.
No, I completely agree with the very good points made by Partha and Mihir about the possibilities of bringing together. And I think the project is about looking at how these different alliances come together to create new type of hybrid knowledges, because I think these kind of multiple perspectives are the way forward. And there are lots of examples in tapestry, but also beyond. If you look at knowledge around ice, around glaciers, in the Arctic, etc. It's about bringing these hybrid perspectives. However, I think, we also have to be careful about not romanticizing this process. It can be quite fraught. It's very important to be aware of power relations, about the fact that academics shouldn't be dominating this process. If it's really transdisciplinary, there's a lot of politics also in bringing together and trying to bridge the gaps. And I think being constantly reflexive about that process is also really, really important. And that's also something that we have to be vigilant about in the project and also more generally beyond.
Can I comment a little bit about this gap between local knowledge and scientific knowledge? This is from my experience of that this particular project in Kutch area. So our scientific knowledge from for instance, this remote sensing data and GIS analysis is evidencing the traditional local knowledge. So this is very, to me, it's kind of interesting and surprising things to, so the local people or has a methodology to get experience-based, knowledge that is usually scientifically correct, probably. So this is from just my experiences, but we need to, evidence. We need to show that evidence is the useful for the local people to, go forward to, improve their lifestyle and so on. So that is my understanding from the experience of this project. So okay, so how about okay, any other questions or comments on
I have a caution.
Okay, go ahead. Yes.
And this is about agrivoltaic technology. And of course, it's very fascinating and it's very promising, and a lot of innovations and inventions are being done around it. But we don't have enough understanding of the impact of such technology in a short and long term, as well as we don't have enough impact on not only the social science aspect of the impact, which is very important in terms of who benefits what from both of these simultaneously happening, but also in terms of overall natural impact, that is what happens to a whole range of species when both things are done together. So I think we need to have some caution on that, just to be cautious. I'm not contesting it, but that's something one has seen happening in some, at least a couple of places. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so any other questions or comments on the three talks? So can I ask the Shilpi and Ranit about the resilience of the Kutch community lifestyle and the community structure or economical structure of the how is the perspective on the resilience of Kutch area?
That's a very broad question, Nobu. So I wonder how to answer it. Should I talk about the resilience of the landscape or the communities that we're working with? And as you know, resilience is a complicated and very loaded word and a very challenging one as well.
Yeah, right.
So as Leila had just, when she opened the session, she mentioned that there's a lot of faith placed in resilience, but who are we asking to be resilient actually is also quite important. So if you're talking about these communities whose adaptive capacities are quite limited now, not just in the face of climate change, but really because of the factors that are affecting the political economy of Kutch. It's droughts, floods, rising salinity levels, sea ingress, commons being reallocated. So it's multiple risks and uncertainties that these communities are facing. So yes, they have been resilient in a way because they are carrying on and they are coping one after the other. But is that what we want, really? Is that what we want for communities who are vulnerable and poor and who haven't emitted? You know, they are not the largest emitters, but they are paying the price for climate change through loss of land, through loss of natural resources. So yes, they are coping, if that is what being resilient is called, but it has very high costs all around, and that is what we are seeing in our work as well. So in this project, we are mindful of the fact that these communities, their adaptive capacity is compromised. And through some of these initiatives, we're trying to interrogate whether it's helping them or not. So we've not actually flashed our results in any way that, yes, it's helpful. We are actually trying to find out what is helpful for whom. So Milk Initiative is helpful in terms of raising or creating livelihood generation opportunities, but for whom? What about young people? Do they really want to carry on with pastoralism? What about women who are actually bearing the burden of a lot of care economy around pastoralism? So it's really important to ask, whose resilience are we talking about?
Oh, yeah,
and not just
right.
in terms of the human capacity, but also the landscape, the human, non-human aspect that Mihir was just referring to. But maybe others want to add, Ranit, Leila, Mihir.
Yeah, maybe just to add from a different perspective, when we talk about resilience, it's also how you reduce the disruption within a system. And as we are talking here about a system which is linked to its natural resources, its social structure, the power structure, and economy. So I guess here, and generally we follow, when we talk about resilience in the disaster parlance, we say that resilience is about rapidity, in which how do you reduce the disruption, how resourceful you are, what kind of redundancies are built into the system, or what kind of are the systems in itself robust to take care of such kind of shocks. So in Kutch, what is my personal experience has been that possibly they have learned, and the kind of disruptions that are there, and even in COVID-19, there had been initial disruptions, but possibly because of factors like their social cohesion and other things, the disruption time was minimized to a certain extent. Again, if we talk about the resourcefulness, of course, they have access to different kind of resources, and which they use for different activities, like not only income generation, but also in their daily life. And I think that access is very important to them. And when we talk about mangroves, that's again something which is where this access to mangroves is very important, and that's where all our project is linked to in different parts. So I think that kind of a resourcefulness is still there, but then the access to different resources are getting diminished, are being challenged because of different top-down approaches. So yes, we need to keep looking at resilience with a benchmark of a shock event, because that's where you test the resilience. Without it, possibly it's very difficult to say that the resilience is changing or is how it is impacting. But possibly the COVID-19 gave us an instance to observe how resilient the communities are, and possibly still we cannot say they were more resilient or less resilient, but at least yes, they can reduce the disruptions and our resourcefulness to a certain extent. Thank you.
Thank you. How about Partha? No, it's okay. How about Mihir, you want to say something?
No, I think resilience is obviously it's a much desired, and there is a lot of excitement about it, and that's the direction to go. But again, not to be a wet blanket, but I'd like to point out some sort of caution there as well, because the side effects of resilience and long-term effects of resilient measures we are taking currently We don't quite know to start with, number one. Number two, the resilience also has negative impact, and we don't know what's the negative impact on the person who is taking the resilient measures, that is the individual, or what is the impact of resilient measures on the other person. So farmers benefit, pastoralists don't, foresters benefit, pastoralists don't. So what is that kind of equation? And third is that what is the impact of resilience on the overall natural ecology? And that is also not being looked at, I feel, quite cautiously and quite carefully. So we need to promote resilience, but with fair amount of caution. And as Leila said, that we need to review these concepts and these activities from time to time so that it is a reflective practice and not something you just move on as a straight path. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Leila.
I mean, I guess with resilience, it originally is from the ecosystem. It looks at it's a systems view, right? And it's more from the natural science. So
right.
We are taking a social science perspective. So I guess it really means adding nuance, adding the socio-political dimension, which probably wasn't originally there in that systems kind of thinking, because the systems kind of thinking is about maintaining the system, not really unpacking what constitutes the system and the pushback and the differences, the heterogeneity, the exclusions.
Okay, thank you very much for various kind of comments on the resilience issues. So I'm very enjoyed the discussion on that. Thank you very much. So I think that's almost time to close this session. So we had a lot many meaningful discussions on the talks. So I'd like to thank you for all speakers and then audience who were participate on that session. Okay, thank you very much. We will have other sessions on that day after tomorrow or someday, day after tomorrow. So please come to that session again. So thank you very much for all of you. All right, I like to close this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Great.
Thank you very much.